Okay, so here we've got a Kali Linux box, and Kali actually has a bunch of tools that you can use to brute force, including Hydra and crackmapexec. So for the purposes of this demonstration, we're actually going to use crackmapexec. So we do know a standard user account and password, so we know that the username is lazy, and we know that the password is password123. Just starting with that limited amount of information, we can actually get pretty far as moving from enumeration into an actual password spray. So let's take a look at that. First, I am going to see what my IP address is. Okay, I am 10.0.0.20 and a /24. Cool, so I will then use nmap to take a look at my subnet. We'll do a SYNSCAN, no need to ping, 10.0.0.1 through 254. We'll let that run for a second and we'll see what we get back. Okay, so we got back a few hosts. This 10.0.0.2 looks very interesting, seeing as it's got global catalog ports that are open. It's got RPC, LDAPs, Kerberos, so this is probably a domain controller. So that's good to keep in mind for 10.0.0.2. All right, so let's move on to crackmap. But first we're going to clear the screen out. So I can use a bunch of different protocols, but I'll go ahead and start with SMB. I can move on to LDAP if needed, but we'll start with SMB and see what we can get from there. So we said that our domain controller was 10.0.0.2. Our user is lazy, and the password was password123. I can give a switch for users. And let's see if we can enumerate a D here. And we can. So crackmap has allowed us to get back all of these usernames that exist inside of Active Directory. So this can be used in order to create your username list if you want to do that. You can also provide a singular user or a list of users that you want to manually put in place. But we were able to pull in every user inside of Active Directory. So that's pretty cool. Looking here, I can see that we've got a couple of interesting accounts. We've got a Batman account, administrator is always going to be there, KRBTGT is always going to be there. So let's go ahead and clear this out, and we'll move on to crackmap's password spraying abilities. So we'll go ahead and start this up kind of the same way that we did before, but instead of just looking at 002, we are going to look at the entire subnet, so 0.0.254. I'm going to specify a few different usernames. So this also could be a user list. You could point it to a file that just contains a bunch of usernames. You could have taken it from that last command that pulled in all the usernames from AD. But there was a couple of names that looked pretty interesting to me, so I'll go ahead and start with those. So we had Batman, administrator, KRBTGT is always a good one, and we'll see what else our user can get to. Then for the password, I'm actually going to specify a password file. So on the desktop, I have the good old RockU, and I'm going to say no brute force. This will help to prevent those accounts from being locked out. All right, so what we're doing is for all of these different IPs, we're doing a password spray using the passwords from the RockU file against the usernames Batman, Administrator, KRBTGT, and Lazy. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop that. That would have run all the way through. If you are familiar with the RockU file, it's a huge one, so it would have gone for a long time. But there is no need for that, because as you can see here, we've already got a hit. So Batman has a password of very secure 1. And this in parentheses that says pwned means that on this Win101 machine, this Batman account has administrative privileges. So doesn't matter if you're using Linux, doesn't matter if you're using Windows, attempting to password spray against Active Directory is fairly simple. Password spraying is a form of brute forcing. And with password brute forcing, it's when an attacker uses as many combination of usernames and passwords to attempt to authenticate to some resource. The problem with this method is that in AD, a lot of times accounts will have a lockout threshold based on a number of bad password attempts. So this can lock out an account completely, as well as potentially trigger alerts. So this is where password spraying comes into play. Password spraying is where an attacker will use the same password but run through a bunch of different usernames. So the attacker may have a username list and just do one password at a time, and for each password go through every username that's on the list, making sure not to exceed the number that's in that lockout threshold. So if you've got a lockout threshold of, let's say, 4, an attacker would then run through 3 password iterations using every single username, and then it would wait a set amount of time before it did it again. And then it would do another 3, it would wait and do another 3, ensuring that those accounts never got locked out. So let's take a look at what an attacker would do if they were on a Windows machine or in a Windows environment. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up PowerShell. One great place to start inside of PowerShell when it comes to enumerating for passwords is to look at the password policies. Any standard user account can query for this and get this information back. So here I just put in the commandlet for get AD default domain password policy, and we can see the minimum password length, which is 7, which would help you build out what type of password list you're going to use, because you know that you need to have passwords that are at least 7 characters long. And lucky for us, in this environment, we have a lockout threshold of 0. Again, this threshold is going to tell you how many times you have to incorrectly guess a password before that account is locked out. And then here you can even see how long an account will be locked out before that account is able to be logged into again. There are a lot of tools that are out that allow you to do password spraying as well as password brute forcing. There's a really good one out by Daft Hack called Domain Password Spray. It's on GitHub. It's fantastic. But actually for this particular demonstration, I actually came up with a really simple password spray script. Wrote it earlier today, and it's a really good proof of concept of how easily an attacker or a purple teamer or red teamer can just create a password sprayer on the fly. So this is a domain joined Windows machine, and all I've done here is I've created a variable and I've pointed it to a word list that I have. So this is a word list that I have in my John the Ripper directory. I'm going to get my domain. All this is doing is it literally is just going to bring in the name of the domain. So here I can see that my domain name is dragon.corp. And then I'm going to copy that word list over to a passwords variable. So I've got my passwords variable and I've got my domain that's here. So now I'm going to jump down to this line 17. This one liner right here is going to bring in every username that's enabled inside of Active Directory, and it's going to save it to this user's variable. The line above it is saying that for every password that exists within that password variable, go ahead and match that up to one of these usernames. Well, all of these usernames. So we're going to do that, and we're going to save that as a PowerShell credential. So for every single one of those passwords, we're going to match that up to every single username. Right? We're going to then attempt to start a notepad process using those credentials. And what this cool little identifier is it just checks the status of a command that was run before it. So if this start process for Notepad was successful, it will also then write me out a nice little message that says the username is whatever the current user is, and the password is whatever the current password is. And it'll write it to this file for me and then open the file up. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that works. Okay, there we go. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop this here. We've got our Notepad process that successfully opened, and we've got our file that was written. So we know that we've got a username of administrator and a password of very secure 2. So we could use that to try to authenticate to something. In fact, we know that we are dragging out corp. We can do something like this: get AD domain, PDC emulator is Dragon DC. Okay, so we can do run. Look at that. So MSTSTS. So this is going to go ahead and open up RDP and try to connect to Dragon DC. We'll use the administrator that we just found and our password of very secure 2. And voila, now we're on a domain controller.